To me, culture is kind of like the heartbeat of the company. It's how everybody interacts both between themselves, how they act every day, and with the customers and suppliers. It's that whole stakeholder, all the
Mhm.
stakeholders, the customers, the suppliers, the vendors, the contractors, the people, and how people interact in an organization to create the culture. Some
Mhm.
cultures are a little stiff, some are a little more lax, and you got to find that culture that fits your personality. And it's never easy. You always got to
Right.
work at it. You
Mhm.
almost need a strategy for developing the culture. You do need a strategy for developing the culture that you want to create.
Welcome to Biz Help for You, the show that saves you the expensive learning curve by providing advice from industry experts in every facet of the entrepreneurial journey. Too many small businesses collapse. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 20% fail within their first year, and less than 35% make it to their 10th anniversary. The goal of this podcast is to change that statistic. So if you're interested in learning more to be a successful entrepreneur, tune in today.
Let me tell you a little bit about my guest today. Scott Springer is the president of Chelwood Consulting Group, a published author and a business growth specialist. He founded his consulting company in 2021 after spending over 20 years in the manufacturing industry with companies like Vital Proteins, Coca-Cola, and Bunge. You can learn how great cultures establish and live by their core values and how these values influence hiring, performance management, and decision-making in manufacturing environments. So, Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. But before I get into questions I have for you, I would love for you first to just share your story of how you became an entrepreneur.
Sure. So I was in the Navy initially. After college, I went to the Naval Academy. I was in the Navy, got out. I don't even as a young age, I always thought I would someday own my own business. When I got out of the Navy, I went into manufacturing. It's kind of very similar to the Navy in a lot of ways. Like being on a ship. And I was in manufacturing. I worked in large companies. I had a couple of small businesses along the way, but I always wanted to run the show. Be the captain of my own ship, right? And so I worked with different companies. I looked over the years, potentially buying some companies. And then my last big company I was with was Vital Proteins, and we doubled every year for 5 years. We sold to Nestle, and then I started my own consulting company, and I'm still looking to get into my own manufacturing companies at some point. So I always have my ears and eyes open for, small manufacturing companies for sale. And I kind of always like to run my own show. I've done it very well running the plant. Like when you're a plant manager, it's almost like you're a small business owner in most companies where you're allowed to you have a lot of freedom depending on the company. But in most companies, the plant manager has a lot of freedom and it's almost like running your own company. And so I always enjoyed that. As I went up and I wasn't any more a plant manager, I was like VP and COO type roles. It was almost less fun than being a plant manager. Plant manager was kind of fun for me,
Right. Well, I know today we're going to talk about culture and core values and how we can really use those to develop strong companies. But I would love for you first to just give the definition or your definition of what culture is. I'm sure a lot of people probably have an idea of what that is, but just in case, it would be great to just have a definition.
Yeah, to me, culture is kind of like the heartbeat of the company. It's how everybody interacts both between themselves, how they act every day, and with the customers and suppliers. It's that whole stakeholder, all the stakeholders, the customers, the suppliers, the vendors, the contractors, the people, and how people interact in an organization to create the culture. Some cultures are a little stiff, some are a little more lax, and you got to find that culture that fits your personality. And it's never easy. You always got to work at it. You almost need a strategy for developing the culture. You do need a strategy for developing the culture that you want to create.
Well, and I've heard before where someone says, if you don't really focus on creating the culture, you've actually created one anyway. It's just kind of happened on its own, and a lot of people may not really understand how that's possible. So do you want to maybe even touch on that? If you are not really focusing on developing it, it's going to happen anyway.
Yeah, it's going to follow, usually it follows the leader, right? Or what the leader allows, right?
Mm.
And so with that saying, it's like it's going to develop anyway. If you allow people to act a certain way, everybody under them is going to act like their leader, right? So you have, let's say in most manufacturing plants, you got a plant manager, or most companies, you got your leader in the company, the owner, the CEO, and then you got your next level managers and your next level managers going down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Under each of those specific leaders, depending on how that person acts, will be how everybody else below them acts.
Mm-hmm.
And how they act is that culture. How they talk to each other, how they interact, how they conduct business. That's the culture. So if you're not diligent in creating the proper culture to each level going down, it's just going to naturally migrate to whatever the leader's natural tendencies are, which might not be the culture you want.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if someone is saying, okay, well, I definitely want to create the culture that I want to have, for my own company, how do they really figure out what core values they should be focusing on for their company, and how do they integrate that to create the culture that they want to have?
There's different ways different companies do it. Like in larger companies, a lot of times you do it, you almost get the managers of the company get together and like, what are our core values? You almost can't force core values. It's almost, it comes from the heart a lot of times. I've seen some companies, I'm not going to say who they are, obviously, but I see some companies where it's the core cultures is just like, window dressing. They write down the core values, but they don't follow the core values. Some of the companies I worked at, I mean, we lived and breathed the core values. And I'll say, for instance, like I started out in the Navy. People in the Navy, for the most part, live and breathe the core values of the Navy. And, Vital Proteins we did. At Bunge, we definitely did. Bunge was probably the best company I ever worked at that instilled core values all the way down from the CEO all the way down. And they changed the core values every few years. As the company migrated, as they changed a little bit over time, they actually changed the core values to match the culture of the company. And then just made sure that the people they brought in and they trained, they talked about them all the time. It was like you would have senior managers on, video calls or, visiting plants, and they're always talking the core values. And so, yeah, you just push it down with leadership and communication, and that's how that's how you spread it.
Right. And once you have, staff already in your company and you're coming up with these core values, you may have some people that aren't quite aligned that you may have to, make some adjustments. But also when you're hiring, like, what do you recommend in terms of figuring out, do these potential new employees have the core values that we're looking for?
Yeah, that's always a tough one, right? Because you have to get that out in an interview, or if you can pull it from, their resume or references. That's a tough one because, a lot of people, they act a certain way on an interview, but it might not necessarily be how they act in real life, and so you got to base your questions to see. A lot of times, when you do interviews, you do open-ended questions. So you can do open-ended questions on, tell me how you demonstrated X core value or Y core value. So I've seen and done interviews like that where we ask people, can you tell us about a time when you were innovative? Where innovation was a core value. So it's hard to get it out in an interview, but you dig it in. And then the key thing we talked about earlier is like, once someone's in an organization, you got to make sure they live up to it and call it. I like to call it out when they don't. We call each other out because sometimes, some core values are pretty strict, I know at Bunge, we would sit in meetings, and, one of the core values at the time back then was openness and trust, right? And it goes down to the customers. And so let's say we got a problem with a customer, and it's like, well, do we tell the customer or not? Or do we just fix it and and then tell them? Or it's like, no, openness and trust. We're gonna be open with them. We're gonna tell them what the issue is. We're telling them what we're doing to fix it. We're telling them when we're gonna fix it, and we're gonna trust that they appreciate that openness that we would demonstrate to the customers. And they always did. Not one time was a customer not like almost excited that we were open with them about any issues. It's like an open book. Here's what we are.
Right.
Here's what happened. We messed up.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I can imagine like when someone is first brought on, the company will be explaining to them, these are the core values
Yeah.
that we have, whatever those might be. But those can be forgotten if they're not really reminded, over time. So,
Yeah.
like, do you want to talk to the person who's listening who has staff, and how often should be they talking about this? Should they have something posted? Like, what are some of the things they should be doing to remind people of what the core values really are?
So everybody does it slightly different. One, you're going to do it through onboarding. You're going to spend a half hour to an hour, whatever it is, talking about the core values. But then you got to do refresher training, whether that's quarterly, annually, or whatever. I know at most of my plants when I was a plant manager, we would do annual, the topic, we'd have a safety topic we talked about. And then, the next topic was the core values. And we went through the core values for 20 to 30 minutes and what it means and examples of what the core values were. But the biggest thing is constant reinforcement. And then a lot of times plants, so put the core values up, you paint it on the wall, you create posters and put them around, so that people can see them all the time.
Right. What do you say to the company that has mainly a remote team? So they don't have everyone together. They don't have where they can have something posted, and they want to encourage, the staff to remember what those core values are. How do they manage that?
Well, here's an easier. So it's always harder when it's remote for some reasons, right? But you do have regular meetings, right? Let's say you got 5 core values, whatever they are, whatever the company is and whatever you have, right? And you have weekly meetings. Once a month, review one of the core values at the beginning of that meeting for 5 minutes. It doesn't take much, 5 or 10 minutes.
Right.
Just constantly review and then cycle through those 5. Talk about when you're in a meeting, you're in a Zoom call. We're doing Zoom calls all day long, most of us. If somebody demonstrates, whether with a customer or with a counter, one of their associates, that they actually performed the core value effectively, they did it right, the way the company wants it,
right.
Call them out in a good way, compliment them in public. Right. You're not going to call them out necessarily in public, right? For if they don't follow it, but if they do follow it, compliment them in front of the group. Always commend in public, reprimand in private. Once in a while you reprimand in public, but you got to be very careful about doing that. But sometimes it can be effective.
Right. Well, then can you share some practical tips on how the entrepreneur can really manage and evaluate their employee performance against core values?
It's just, for me, when I did it, it was always a day-to-day, week-to-week evaluation, making sure everybody's walking the talk. That's the key. Everybody can talk the talk. A lot of companies do the window dressing core values, but walk the talk, right? And demonstrate it. Most companies on there, if you're doing semi-annual, annual evaluations, you're going to have a section, a pretty decent sized section, a good percentage of that evaluation should be demonstrating the core values. Did you follow these 4 core values, 6 core values, whatever? Every company has different amounts. So the evaluations is one way. And just most people have weekly one-on-ones or monthly one-on-ones with their employees, even the remote employees. Talk about the core values during those meetings. Either directly or indirectly. You don't have to specifically go down the list of the core values, but just talk about them.
Right. So then how do business owners really use these core values to guide their decision making, right? If they have to decide on who they should be working with as a vendor or a customer or any of these kind of things that come up, in business, how do they really use those core values to guide them?
Yeah, like I said, probably the best I've seen as a company as a whole do the core values with Bungie. And it was regularly part of sales discussions, supply chain discussions, vendor discussions. If any of our vendors or customers were not following our core values, the big one, we always talked about, some of the core values are aspirational. Some of them are table stakes. Integrity, not everybody has integrity as a core value, but it's kind of like integrity is like table stakes. If you don't have integrity, you shouldn't be in business.
Right.
And there's a lot of people in business who don't have integrity, but they don't they don't succeed for very long. And it's just, follow them, figure out what your core values are. And then when you're making the decisions, like I gave the example of like when we had, talking about a sales and a product issue we had, it's like, okay, are we following the core values? When you're making a critical decision for the business, whether it's strategy, customer decision, or vendor decision, or major ones, when you come up with your decision, you sit around a table, you're collaborative, you got 5 people, you come up with this major strategic initiative. When you're done, right, before you implement it, check, do a little check. Is this decision following our core values? Right? And it's like, yeah, it is, and all of it. Or it's like, maybe it's not. Maybe is this really innovative? Depending on what, I've been in a couple companies where innovation was a core value. It's like, are we really being innovative here? Or can we be better at it?
Right. So can you touch on maybe some of the common challenges that businesses face then when they're trying to establish and sustain a great culture, and how can they overcome those obstacles?
The biggest obstacles almost always is peer pressure, or people avoiding conflict, right? So if a manager wants to address a core value issue, they want to avoid it. Most people don't like conflict. Some people do, but most people avoid the conflict. And when you don't address a violation of the core values, basically you're condoning it and you're allowing it, right? So that's number one, is you got to make sure you address it every single time. And then sustaining it, just the things we talked about, is that you want to be talking about it all the time. You want to be, become a part of the vocabulary that people use regularly. And that's why the core value has to come from the heart. It has to come from the group. It can't be necessarily pushed down from the top. Sometimes it can, but it's like, who are we? What do we want to be?
Right. Well, you have to have the buy-in of the staff, right? Because if they're not going to agree, they're not going to follow those core values, which once again comes back to, if you are now just coming around to like, oh, I really should identify core values, you may have some people on your staff that don't align with that any longer, and you'll have to make some of those decisions, regarding what you're going to do in that situation.
And some of those decisions can be tough decisions that people don't like to make, Some long-term employees, some people with a lot of experience. Or the other thing, I talked about peer pressure. The other thing that often becomes a sticky point with core values is the money game. Your quote unquote top performer who's not following the core values, your best salesperson who's not following the core values. Like, what do you do at that point? There's a great drawing that one of my first bosses showed to me. You got your 4 boxes, right? And one of the axes is culture, which is the core values, right? And so you got low culture or low core values, high culture, high core values. And then the other axis is performance, high performance, low performance, right? So obviously the people in the high performance, high core values, right, you want to keep around, right? And the people who are low culture, low performance, you want to get rid of them. What do you do with the other ones? Who's your next best employee, right? Is it the high core value, low performer, or is it the high performer, low core value? Who's more valuable to the company? And the point he made, and it's true, and I've seen it at every company since then. And this was my first boss as a plant manager. Steve Kuzer showed me this. He's like, your next best employees is always your high culture, high integrity, high core value person, low performer. You can always improve the performance, or the person's in the wrong position, move him to another role. He'll become a high performer, or she, becomes a high performer. But you want to keep the organization in that high culture, high core value, high integrity. And even your high performers that are low culture, low integrity, low core values, they need to, 1, 2, 3 strikes and you're gone. If they don't change and move up into the top box, having the high values and high core values, if they don't move up into that box, they got to go.
Right. Well, along the money lines too, I was also thinking that someone may have some concerns about ending relationships with customers or vendors too, even though they may not match the culture too, because, well, this vendor, we get what we need, on time, or we have better pricing, or whatever that situation is. Or the customer may be like, well, this is a top revenue client. We can't afford to lose them right now. And so they put up with some of these things that they generally wouldn't have otherwise. So do you have anything to say to, the entrepreneur who is like, well, I really want to make a change, but financially, I don't see how I can right now?
Yeah, I would definitely give the feedback to the customer or supplier, what our core values are. And just like you would to your employees, give it to them. It's like, look, we want to continue working with you. We like working with you, customer or supplier, but these are our core values, and you're not demonstrating it when you're working with us. We don't care what you do with other people, right? But when you're working with us, you got to demonstrate integrity. You got to be open with us, or whatever, you got to be innovative, whatever your core values are, and we don't see you doing this, so, and same thing with that low culture, high performing employee, right? The suppliers and vendors are the same. It's like, you got to give them chances to improve.
Right.
And it might not be the company, it could be the person you're dealing with too. It could be your buyer or their salesperson that is demonstrating low culture, but the company itself and everybody else in the company is fine. Maybe you go up their chain of command and let them know, it's like, hey, we're seeing this and we're not liking what we see. And if it is prevalent throughout the whole organization, guarantee you there's other suppliers and other customers that'll come around.
Right. Well, that's a good point to even reach out to the company. Let's say it's a salesperson that you're working with and they're not the best fit for your company. Being able to give the company a chance to make a change, find another person or something, because like you said, it may just be that one person and they could have a great team, and so you would hate to ruin that relationship because you're like, oh, this person isn't the right fit. We're not going to work with you any longer.
I got kind of a funny, sad also story. Like, first time I was a plant manager, I had a truck driver at the dock and he makes a racist comment to one of my guys. My warehouse manager comes to my office, steam coming out of his ears. He's all mad. I'm like, I got this, right? I'm like beeline going to the docks. I'm going to take care of this truck driver. And on the way there, I want to gather information, make sure it's not just someone saying something. I asked, a bunch of witnesses along the way. By the time I make it to the docks, I walk right up. I'm like, where's the guy? And I walk right up to him and I'm like, did you say this to, one of my guys? He's like, yeah. He's like, oh, yeah. I'm like, get out of my building, and he's like looking at me like I'm nuts. He's like, I'm doing a load. I'm like, I don't care. Get out of my building. I said, you got about a minute to get out of this building or I'm calling the police. And I pull out my phone and I was going to call the police. I was going to get that guy, handcuffed, thrown out of the building. Right. So he leaves. And I was like, okay. And I'm still, I stayed calm. I didn't yell at him, but I'd kick him out of the building right away in front of everybody, in front of all my people. And then I go to our dispatcher, right? And I'm like, get that trucking company on the phone right now, right? And so calls the trucking company, calls their dispatcher, the trucking company's dispatcher, and I call him, this truck with this guy picking up this load, blah, blah, blah. He said this and da-da-da. I just to let you know, I kicked him out of the building. I don't want that guy ever back in the building again. And the guy goes, ugh, that's going to be a problem. I'm like, what's the problem? He's like, that's the owner's son. I was like, okay, you want me to talk to the owner? Tell him his son's not allowed back in the building or I'll find another trucking company. There's plenty of trucking companies,
right?
And if he's sending his son out there making racist comments, how long is that guy going to be in business? Right? He's not going to be in business for long. People aren't going to put up with that, Right. And so it's just kind of like, I don't care if it's the owner's son. It's like, you want me to talk to his dad? Put him on the phone. He's like, no, I'll talk to him.
Well, and you probably did him a favor even by bringing to his attention, because like you said, if that was happening in other places, they could be losing business because of that performance.
Or creating just animosity and just everything that goes along with that type of culture, that type of, that's that kid's core value. He's probably in his 20s or 30s or something like that. I don't know how old he was.
Right.
But, he was fairly young. He was a son,
Exactly. Well, I know we're coming towards the end of time we have together, so I would love to ask if you have an offer that you would like to share with our listeners.
Well, I'm a consulting company. There are certain things that we do. We can help companies grow and scale. We have different programs. We can help you build facilities if you're a manufacturing plant. We can help you if you're a small business, right? I also do a lot of business coaching and can help you scale up. I've scaled businesses 100% a year. When I was at Vital Proteins, we grew 100% a year for 5 years. And right now I run my own consulting business trying to help companies do the same. And so if you want to scale up, please reach out to me.
Mm-hmm. And how can they find you?
Email is probably the best way. Scott@chelwoodgroup.com. You could either find me through my website or just email me directly. That would be great. I'd love to work with you.
Well, thank you, Scott, for being a guest on my show and sharing your detailed information on this topic of culture and the core values. It's important for people to understand. So I appreciate your taking the time to do so.
Thank you very much. It's great being here.
And to the listener, if you enjoyed today's topic and you want to hear additional information, you can find access to exclusive content in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in today. Would you please share this episode with those you know and leave a review on your favorite platform? And if you find our show informative, would you consider being a financial sponsor to help me continue my mission to educate business owners? A link is located in the episode description, and no amount is too small. I'd really appreciate your support. If you are interested in connecting with our guest and receiving the offer they had to share, a link to our resource page is in the show notes. Finally, if you have any bookkeeping or payroll needs, reach out to us at 310-534-5577 or contact@abandp.com. My team and I are eager to assist you. Until next time, have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Biz Help for You. Please join your host, Candy Messer, again next time. Have a terrific day.